All right, so next up is Zakir Durumeric. Where is he? There he is. I hope I said your name correctly. Zakir is going to talk about email. We mentioned in Brian's talk a little bit about how email is not the best way to exchange this information, and you have no idea. All right, here he is.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. So, is this right? So this project kind of started with this idea of we send email all the time, but whenever we think about email security, we kind of think about PGP, and we think about these end-to-end principles, but on a day-to-day basis, what percentage of email do each of you send that's actually protected by PGP? My guess is it's a small amount. So how secure really is email on a day-to-day basis? There's this kind of weird property that no matter when you send an email, it always seems to go through. And in the HTTPS space, that's not really the case. We run into warnings, we run into problems, things don't go how we want. But in email, no matter what, it goes through, and this was kind of a warning sign to us. And so we teamed up at the University of Michigan with the Google Abuse team and the Google Gmail team to essentially look at, well, how secure is email on a day-to-day basis, kind of at the transport layer. If you're not using end-to-end encryption, how secure is your email? What does this actually look like? So if we take a step back to how does email work before we start all of this, when you go and you send an email, whether this be from Thunderbird on your laptop or from the Gmail web interface, you essentially send your email to your organization's SMTP server. And you give this email to the SMTP server and you say, hey, here's the message, can you make sure it gets to the destination where it needs to go and take care of all the details. And then you can sign offline, you can go away, and that server essentially takes responsibility for that message. Your email server essentially does what we call an MX record lookup. It essentially goes to the destination domain and says, who are your SMTP servers? Where should I deliver this message? It gets back an SMTP server, whether it be something like smtp.gmail.com. It says, okay, what is that IP address? It gets an IP address, and it goes ahead and makes an SMTP connection to smtp.gmail.com. At that point, as far as the sender cares, it's made it to the destination. It kind of forgets about that message. And then later, whoever the recipient is can come and they can fetch this message, whether it be through the web interface or through POP3 or through IMAP. And these first two steps are really the ones you see on a daily basis. It's when you send the email from your laptop to your organization, or when you go and you fetch the email from your email server. And these essentially act kind of how we'd expect them to. They use TLS in the same manner that HTTP uses TLS. You start a TLS connection, you get back a certificate, you verify the certificate. If all looks good, you send your email. And so there are these two pieces, and this is kind of what the user sees, and that all is good and well. But there's this kind of middle piece, which is actually the piece that we care about the most, which is, well, how does my organization actually get the message to the destination organization? This kind of delivery SMTP message. So all these messages are delivered using the SMTP protocol, which originally had no built-in security. Essentially, your email would be sent in the clear. You would hope you connected to the right person. You would hope there was no eavesdropping. And essentially, we hope that no one was lying. We hope that whenever you received a message, that all was good. And as time went on, we realized, you know, the world is not quite so rosy. This might not be quite the guarantees we want to provide. And we start to add on essentially extensions to SMTP to add on these additional pieces of functionality. And so we introduced these SMTP extensions over time that encrypt email, that authenticate the email when they receive it. But again, this kind of stuff in the middle is kind of, it's voluntary. The end user doesn't really see this immediately. They don't know whether this step is encrypted or not. They don't have any ability to say, I only want this message to be delivered if it's encrypted. So the first extension that was introduced is called STARTTLS. And this essentially is similar to how TLS is used in HTTPS, except that TLS is done within the SMTP connection instead of around it. And so essentially what happens is that you start this TLS connection, and then if there are any passive eavesdroppers, they aren't able to essentially eavesdrop on any mail because it's protected by its TLS channel. And mechanicalistically what happens is you start your TCP connection, you say, hey, I want to deliver some mail, the mail mail server says, great, I'm also a mail server, all things look good. By the way, I support STARTTLS. I also support all the other extensions. I support compression. I support UTF-8. This is what I can do. And you say, great, I want to do STARTTLS. And you essentially send this STARTTLS command over SMTP. You do a normal TLS session, all goes well, and you send your message. So at first hand, this seems fairly reasonable, but there's a stark difference to how we've used TLS from HTTPS, and that's the fact that we use TLS in an opportunistic manner. And this is different from HTTPS. In HTTPS, when we connect to a website over HTTPS and it doesn't work, Chrome throws up an error, Firefox throws up an error, and it says, look, you can't connect. No good. And the user might say, you know, that's okay, I trust this certificate, I know what's going on. But for most people, we hope that they stop looking at the website at this point. SMTP is the opposite. Unlike HTTPS, if you aren't able to communicate using STARTTLS, you essentially say, well, shucks. Like, I tried, it didn't really work out, that's just life, I'm now going to deliver this mail over clear text. And this is what's kind of hidden from users in this ecosystem. And in the beginning, this kind of made sense. This was kind of added later on. SMTP didn't have these features originally, and we said we need to have some way of essentially rolling this out within the community. Now everyone will support STARTTLS in the beginning. If you can, that's great, and we'll see where we end up. But we ended up in this weird position today now where senders don't really validate the destination servers, because if they validate the destination server and they say, well, the certificate is expired, then the option is to send an email in clear text. So you can say, well, I can send email to this expired certificate, and then at least it'll be protected against passive eavesdroppers, or I can validate the certificate and then not send the email encrypted at all and send it over clear text. And we said, you know, sending it encrypted at all is strictly better than sending this in clear text. That is clearly the thing we should do here. And so we ended up in the position where senders don't validate any of the destination servers, and because nobody validates the destination servers, none of the servers you're delivering mail to really provide anything that allows you to authenticate. We've kind of gotten stuck in this weird catch-22. But more importantly than that, as we'll talk about, many servers don't even support STARTTLS at all. It's not even an option. So we decided to look at, well, what are the mail servers that are popularly used on the internet, both in terms of scanning the IPv4 address space and popular domains, and also to investigate the email that was coming in and out of Gmail to see, well, what percentage of email is actually encrypted. I'm going to skip past that. So STARTTLS, as seen by Gmail over the last 2 years, has increased dramatically. From 2003 to 2015, we've gone from below 40% of outbound traffic that leaves Gmail that goes to servers to almost above 80% that is encrypted, that is protected by STARTTLS. And for messages that are inbound to Gmail, we've gone from around 30% to around 60%. And in some ways that looks like, well, you know, this has been a fairly significant jump. We've made significant progress in the last 2 years. And at this point, the majority of inbound and outbound email that Gmail sees is protected. But if we look at this, we also see there's kind of been a couple of giant hops along the way. And this is essentially when Yahoo and Hotmail deployed STARTTLS. And when you look at the rest of the lines, it's not quite as optimistic. Yes, people are slowly starting to deploy STARTTLS, but it's a rather slow and kind of gradual growth. And if we actually zoom in and look at this in a little bit higher resolution, you see this very interesting pattern, where what you see here is the differences between weekdays and weekends. And we go up and down every week, and essentially what happens is the email that is delivered on Saturday and Sunday, more email is encrypted than on weekdays. And so essentially what happens is people go home and they use their personal email accounts. They use their Gmail account and they email their other friend that uses their Yahoo account. And these large cloud providers, they do security well. They have things properly set up, everything goes according to plan. And then everyone goes back to their corporation, they go back to their work on Monday, and they start sending email using their work's email servers, and those are the ones that are likely less well configured. Those are the ones that don't support STARTTLS. We also see this kind of sad dip here in 2014, and that essentially is when the Poodle vulnerability happened down to the day. And what happened is when the Poodle vulnerability came out, it was a vulnerability in the TLS protocol that had to do with still allowing SSL v3 connections. And essentially, the academic communities told everyone, go and disable SSL v3. No one uses SSL v3 anymore. There's no reason you need it. Nobody uses it. Everyone uses TLS. And everyone went out and disabled SSL v3, but what appears is that people also inadvertently just disabled all of TLS. And then a couple days later, they realized they had made this mistake and re-enabled it. But it kind of says something to kind of how fragile this ecosystem is and kind of how hidden this is compared to what we normally consider about TLS when we normally focus on HTTPS alone. So that was based on the email that comes in and out of Gmail, which is very dominated by large providers. You have these large cloud providers, whether these be Hotmail or Yahoo or Gmail, that a lot of people use. But you have this very long tail of actual organizations, and only about 80% of them support STARTTLS at all. There's any ability to essentially say, I want to encrypt this email message. About 35% of those have certificates that match the MX server that essentially match smtp.umich.edu, and less than 1% that have certificates that match umich.edu or whatever that domain is that really let you authenticate that you're connected to the right person. And so we have quite a ways to go before we can really say email is being encrypted all the time. There are still many organizations that are lagging, and while we are seeing growth in the total email that is being protected, there's still a long way to go for this long tail that lags behind. So we have this protocol, the STARTTLS protocol, where we say, you know, if I'm not able to start a STARTTLS connection, that's fine. I am going to then send my email in the clear. And so you say to yourself, well, what happens if there's an attacker? And what is the simplest way an attacker could essentially prevent a TLS session from occurring? And essentially what you could do is just corrupt any part of the handshake. And the simplest part of this would probably be to just prevent the TLS handshake from ever starting to begin with, and saying, you know, when the server says that they support STARTTLS, I'm just going to remove that from their list of options that they support, and the client will say, well, that server does not support STARTTLS. That's really a shame. I guess I'll send my email in the clear. And so if you just replace the STARTTLS command in the list of features, or just corrupted it, the client is really none the wiser and delivers the email. And on the other side, you can say, well, even if the client tries to start a TLS connection anyway, just corrupt this command. When the client sends it to the server, send back, you know, that's an unrecognized command. I don't support that. And the client says, oh, okay, they don't support STARTTLS. I guess I'll send my email in the clear. And so STARTTLS prevents against passive eavesdropping, but currently it provides zero protection against any active attacker sitting between the two servers. So the kind of nice thing is if you take this naive approach and just corrupt the command, this is detectable. When you get back to the list of features you see on a mail server, you have these commands that aren't SMTP commands. They've never been SMTP commands. They look like gibberish. They actually look like all X's. And if you send STARTTLS to servers, you'll get back these error messages that say, why did you send me this gibberish? This isn't a real command, and it'll echo the command back. And so we looked for these instances of this corruption on the internet, and we originally stumbled upon these doing these internet-wide scans of the IPv4 address space, and we saw these gibberish commands coming back, and it originally started off as this, why do we see this? Like, what is going on? And as we delved into it, we saw that there's actually quite a few servers on the IPv4 address space that have this phenomenon where this command is corrupted. And so what we did is we went back and looked at the Gmail data and said, what percentage of email is coming to and from these servers that have these messages corrupted, that essentially are prevented from starting a STARTTLS command and encrypting that message because there's someone sitting between those two servers that corrupt it and prevent it from occurring. And we call it STARTTLS Stripping. What we see is in that a list of countries, it's more than 20%, more than 10% of email that is unable to be encrypted. In the case of Tunisia, it's more than 96% of email that is prevented from being encrypted by something sitting between those two servers. And so this is happening. This is happening in almost every country. It might not be quite as a high percentage, but if you keep going down looking at this country, you'll see it in the United States, you'll see it in Western Europe, you see it in Asia, you see it everywhere. You see these servers that are prevented from being able to start TLS commands, and because of that, they're sending all this email in the clear. And when you start to dig down why, what you realize is there's actually devices that manufacturers have put out on the market that do this. Cisco actually advertises this functionality where they say, look, we'll look for your attacks that are happening against your SMTP server, and we'll prevent them. We'll prevent people from sending mail to certain users of yours. We'll block certain users from sending you email. We'll look for buffer overflow attacks. But the way they accomplish this is by saying, look, we can't do that if your connection's encrypted. Like, we won't be able to tell. It'll be protected by TLS. So what we'll do is we'll prevent any start TLS command from ever occurring. We'll prevent any TLS handshake from happening, and when you do that, you're able to look for these attacks, but you're also potentially putting all of your users at risk because that email then can be eavesdropped upon. And it's unclear, based on the documentation, whether operators even really know what this decision means, that they're putting their users at risk, that all of this email is then being sent over the internet in the clear. So the state of transport security is that we protect against passive eavesdroppers, but there's currently no protection against active adversaries, and we do see that happening in the wild. And a little bit later I'll talk about kind of where we go from here. But I also want to talk about the second piece, which is how do you authenticate messages that come to you? And essentially, over the years, we've essentially deployed protocols that essentially were driven by the amount of spam that receivers had, that essentially allowed receivers to determine whether the email they received was actually sent by the legitimate sender. And so we developed these three protocols called SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. SPF is probably the simplest, and essentially a sender is able to publish a DNS record that just says, look, these are my IP addresses of my mail servers, only accept email messages if they come from one of my servers, if not, reject them. And so a recipient receives an email message, they essentially do this DNS lookup, they look up this policy, and they say, you know, that did not come from one of your MX servers, that did not come from one of your IP addresses, and we're going to throw it in our spam folder. The second protocol is called DKIM, and essentially allows the sender to cryptographically sign any email that they send, and they essentially attach this cryptographic signature as a header to the email message. But there's this kind of oddity in the DKIM protocol, which is that it's impossible to know if a domain is going to send their email signed or not, because the only place to look up the key that it'll be signed by is specified in the email itself. And so if you're an attacker and you decide you're going to change someone's email along the path, the attack's pretty easy. You just remove the signature. And maybe the receiver has known in the past that they received signed email, maybe they don't. It's unclear what to do. And so the mail community essentially introduced a called DMARC, which essentially allowed the sender to say, these are what my policies are, this is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to do if you receive an email that is not from one of the IP blocks in my SPF record. This is what I want you to do if you receive an email that is not signed by me. And it lets them say, I want you just to reject it altogether, I want you to put it in your spam folder, I want you just to report it back to me so that I know this is happening. And so essentially these three protocols all work in tandem together, where you're able to use these three types of records to essentially tell a sender what they should expect. So what does this look like? For the messages that come into Gmail, the Gmail is able to validate the vast majority. Only 6% that make it through really have no validation through SPF, DKIM, or a combination of both. And this looks really pretty good. This is quite optimistic. But we again have this problem where we have this very long tail of organizations, where if you go look at the top 1 million domains on the internet, less than 50% of them have an SPF policy at all. And in the DMARC case, it's a very small number. It's less than about 1%, but less than 1% actually say reject or quarantine the messages that you receive. Most of them just say report them back to me. So it's a fraction of a percent of organizations that have actually deployed all three of these steps or some combination to say, this is what I want you to do to authenticate my mail. Going forward, there are a couple drafts kind of in play within the IETF to kind of help these problems. Within the the transport security world, there is a draft called Strict Transport Security, which is very similar to how we use HSTS within the HTTPS world. You want to have a server that can somehow say, look, if you're going to deliver email to me, I only want you to deliver it to me over TLS. And I only want you to deliver it to me if you see this key pair, and if you don't deliver it to me. Just wait until you can find me in the right state to send it to me. So this is currently in discussion. There's this problem of, well, how do you do this securely? Do we use DNS to try to look up these records? And if there's an attacker in the middle, then can't they block those DNS responses? Do we use the web PKI and say, look, we have HTTPS, it works? Do we try to use HTTPS? But then you have to say, well, now if you want a mail server, you also have to have an HTTPS site. And sure, now you have to maintain 2 certificates. And so it's a little bit more burdensome. And so there's still a lot of discussion of, well, how do you do this correctly? There are a lot of people who say, well, isn't this why we developed DANE or DNSSEC? But the problem is that in the real world, a lot of people still don't use this, and we need a solution today. Within the authentication scheme arena, DKIM had some problems where it could not be deployed because of mailing lists. Essentially, you would send your email to a mailing list and they tack this footer on the bottom that says, you received this message because you're subscribed to CloudFlare announcements, and if you want to unsubscribe, click on this link. And the moment you add that footer to the message, the signature no longer matches, and receivers start to essentially bounce all of your messages. And so because of many people were hesitant or did not deploy DKIM, Yahoo actually deployed it and then immediately took it back, I think within hours of having deployed it, because so many messages were not able to get through. And so there's kind of a more complex approach called ARC, which essentially says we can have stuff the way. If the first hop receives a message, it can validate it, it might change it, it'll sign it again, it'll send it on to the next hop. You can try to validate this chain. Recently, Google also deployed indicators within Gmail that says whether or not a message that you received was protected by STARTTLS, or if the person you're about to send a message to does not support STARTTLS. And there's no way to essentially ensure that a message will use STARTTLS all the way through because there can be multiple hops, but it is possible to say there's no way this message is going to be protected, or this message was not protected when it was sent to us. After that deployment, there actually has been an increase, and this is starts kind of a truncated axis here, but we have started to see a slow improvement after those features were rolled out. So the current state of affair is a little bit sad. I don't think it's quite what we as the cryptographic community want to see in our email. I think a lot of us would like to get to the point where we know that this transport security is provided, that we kind of have the same guarantees we see in HTTPS, where when we send an email, though, we know there is a TLS connection that is being taken. But we are continuing to get better. People are starting to deploy STARTTLS. The numbers are going upwards. In the last couple of years, they've gone up significantly. And hopefully, if this trend continues, we can get to the point where we can say, look, we're going to start to enforce this for everyone one day. We're going to say, look, there's 100% of servers that support this, that we can provide these new guarantees. And so hopefully, as time goes on, we'll start to see those changes. Thanks.
In one of your earlier slides, you had something like 30-something% that is actually happening.
Yeah. Way back.
Is the law on Gmail representative when they don't match?
Is the what?
The red law feature of this connection was insecure. Is that?
I don't know for sure. I believe it's validated, but I believe there's a blog post that Google has put out that has the details, but I don't know for sure.
Where is the statistic about how many sites are using DMARC? There was red down there, and
Yeah, no.
so those multiplied out to a fraction of a percent, but nothing on this site.
Oh, so these are kind of different perspectives. I actually don't know for Gmail what the DMARC numbers are.
Okay. Okay, thanks again, Zakir.